says something about the rip tide or the rip current or strong undercurrents. You see that sign, what does that tell you? It tells me don't get in the water. But maybe you feel good about your swimming ability and you say, okay, I'm still going to get in the water, but what is the sign actually telling you? Well, I mean, what is the undercurrent? What is that? Something in the water that Gail said you can't see it, but it poses a serious threat. And specifically, it's a threat that can cause drowning. I mean, water is a powerful force, right? The water can pull you in and drag you out to deeper water. And if you're not a strong swimmer, it can pose a dangerous threat to your life. But moving beyond an undercurrent in the ocean, you think about the power of water as a force. We see that in hurricanes and tsunamis and those kinds of natural disasters. Water is a very powerful force when you can see it, but in this case, it's even powerful when you can't see it. And I think that's the frightening part. You know, these unseen dangers, they don't give us any kind of warning. I mean, if you don't know about them, nobody knows to put a sign up on the beach that says, don't get in the water. There's no warning there. And so you may go out thinking you're just going to go for a swim and you don't think anything of it. And yet there's this danger out there that you don't have any idea about. So you think about that idea of an undercurrent, a danger that exists, but you can't see it, a powerful force that is dangerous to you, but you don't know it's there. So let's make the spiritual follow-up to that. What is a spiritual undercurrent? Why are those so dangerous? Same reason, right? Yeah, Alan's, you can't see them coming. There are spiritual dangers that churches and individuals face, and we may not see them. We may not know that they're coming. And we get completely taken by surprise or blindsided by these things. And when these unseen problems eventually are manifested, they cause serious spiritual danger. They can lead us to spiritual ruin. So as we've been doing this quarter, we're talking about the church in the crosshairs. And what we mean by that is the church is in the crosshairs of Satan. And so we're talking about dangers that exist at the congregational level, things that we need to be thinking about and preparing for before they hit. But some of these dangers, some of them we can see them coming from afar. But some of them we can't. And so we have to be especially sober and vigilant as we look for those. So one example of a spiritual undercurrent that we're going to talk about today is selfishness within a church. Now, we're not so much focusing on a selfish person or a selfish individual. We're talking about an attitude of selfishness that is pervasive in the entire church, collectively, an attitude of selfishness. I don't know that this is something I've given a whole lot of thought to until recent weeks. And as I've thought about this a little bit more, I've come to think that this may be one of those undercurrents that we don't see. This may be a danger that we don't think about until it rears its ugly head in whatever form it may do that. So let's talk first of all about the qualities of selfishness in an individual. All right. I know I said that's not really our focus today, but the qualities of selfishness are going to be the same from an individual to the collective group. So when you think about a person who is selfish, how would you describe them? What are the qualities of that person? Call them out to me. They lack empathy. Okay. They're unable to sympathize or empathize with others and what they're going through. That's interesting. I hadn't considered that one. What else? Self-importance. Okay. What else? All right. Little to no concern for anybody else. They put themselves first. They rarely consider other people or how their words or their actions affect other people. What kinds of personality traits might you see in a selfish person? Think about their attitudes. Think about the way they interact with others. How might they come across?
Talk about
Okay, so that they only talk about themselves. What else? Arrogance. Okay, that could certainly be there. There may be. Okay, Ronnie said pride is an obvious one. Donna, did you say something? Right. Okay. I think a selfish person may be, not, it doesn't have to be this way, but they may be forceful or very abrasive as they're trying to get their way or make sure things are done the way they think is best or whatever the application may be. They may be coercive in an effort to get their own way or get what they want. And so we think about words like narcissism, vanity, self-absorption, and so forth. All of these things that we've said are qualities of a selfish individual. Now, the follow-up question then is, well, what is the answer to individual selfishness? And of course, I'm talking the Bible answer here. What is the response to this? So here we've got a person who is he's outside of Christ. He's lost. He's in the world, but now he decides to come to Christ, and now he's got to make some changes. So what does he have to do to overcome his selfishness? Put others before himself, all right? And I think I put this in your material. I'd like to get some scriptures to go along with these. So did you have passages that coincide with that? Yeah, okay, go ahead and say it. Yeah, all right, let's look at that. Philippians chapter 2. That's the one that I put down. That one first came to mind, but there are others as well, I'm sure. Philippians chapter 2. And this may be the plainest of the scriptures that we have on this subject. Philippians 2 and verse 3. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. And of course, Paul goes on to talk about how that's what Jesus did when he humbled himself and came to this earth to meet our needs of forgiveness and mercy. So we need to have that attitude in us as Jesus had in himself. Okay, Christine, do you have something? Okay, good. Yeah, Galatians 5. And there's really no aspect of life that doesn't speak to in some way or another. Okay, Ronnie?
I think in the New Testament we find what we refer to as one another passages.
Yes.
There's a whole series of them where you find that phrase one another. And I went through, wrote them down, and we're members. We need to see ourselves as members of one another, connected to one another. Be kindly affectionate to one another, prefer one another, be like-minded toward one another, receive one another, admonish one another, greet one another, serve one another, bear one another, with one another, submit to one another, encourage one another.
Yeah.
All of those are rules, I guess we call them, but admonitions of how we can correct this self-centered.
Good. Aren't there like 12 or 13 such?
12.
12, yeah, in the New Testament, these one another passages. That's good. Each one of those would speak directly to this.
Yes.
Yeah, very good. All right. Any other ones come to mind? Romans 12:3. All right. Jake, are you there? Read it in a big godlike voice.
For through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think so as to have sound judgment as God has allotted each measure of faith.
Good. Don't think of yourself more highly than you should think. All right. So any text that talks about humility and having a humble spirit, humble attitude, and we've mentioned two texts specifically, but then all the texts that Ronnie mentioned, although he didn't cite them, but we could go through and do that. There are scores of texts that help with this problem of individual selfishness. But if you've got a whole bunch of people individually in a church who possess a selfish spirit, then it won't be long for that leaven to spread and begin to have an influence in the whole church. And we would then say that the church as a whole could have this kind of a spirit. Now, I put some things in your material that may be manifestations of a church that is stuck on itself. Let's just look at some of these, and I'd be curious to see if you came up with any other ones. A church that is selfish might be characterized by prayers that focus only on the membership. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying with this. I'm not saying it's wrong to pray for the membership. I'm certainly not saying that. We do that all the time, as we should. But if the prayers are solely focused on who's in the house, that might be an indicator of where our focus is. You with me on that? If there's never any requests made to God on behalf of others, be them other Christians in other parts of the world who may need help, or be it lost people right here in this community who need God, that might say something about us if our prayers are solely focused on ourselves. You can tell a lot about a person by looking at how they spend their money. You ever heard somebody say that before? You can tell a lot about a church by the way they spend their money. So the second thing I put on the list, money being used with entirely inward focus, nothing external. You can look at a church budget sheet and you can see where their priorities are. You can see what they emphasize by where they spend their money. Comfort is prioritized before sacrifice or hardship. I hope you did a little reflection on this one. This is one that I think may be a challenge for a lot of churches. I included a quotation on your handout by a guy named Tom Rainer. He wrote a book called Autopsy of a Deceased Church. And it's an interesting book. What he does is, Mr. Rainer is a denominational guy, kind of a leader in denominational publications. He's written some really good stuff. And he basically did a study of a series of churches that either died and just closed their doors because they got to be so small they couldn't sustain it, or they were in decline and they were heading that direction. And he went in and he did a very detailed kind of longitudinal study of these congregations and what happened. And he did financial audits and he interviewed former pastors and staff. I mean, it was a really comprehensive kind of thing. And then he published this tiny little book, about 100 pages, with some of the things that he learned. It's a really good little book. And one of the things he said in there is, in dying churches, the last expenditures to be reduced are those that keep the members most comfortable. And so here's what he meant by that. So let's say here's a church that's spending a lot of money on some evangelism effort in another country. All right, they're sending money to preachers in another country and supporting the gospel over there. But then as the church back home has dwindled in size, people have gotten older, maybe folks have died and they haven't, grown, they haven't had any conversions or whatever. The number is dwindling. Where do you think they start pulling the money from first? The things that are going on far away. Yeah. So that they start taking the money away from those kinds of efforts, evangelism efforts in other places, and start making sure, we got to keep the HVAC system maintained and make sure that, we have nice carpet and make sure we need a new sound system. And I'm not saying any of that's bad stuff, just saying the focus changes. The things that are cut first are the things that don't affect the home group, the home team. Okay? I think it's an interesting thing to ponder. And then finally, I put on your material that there's a spirit of contentment and complacency that prevails, and there's no consideration of improvement that might be made. I'm curious, did you come up with anything else as you thought about this? How might a church display an attitude of selfishness collectively? Did you come up with anything else? Ronnie?
I think the church in Laodicea is a prime example.
We've talked about them a couple times this quarter. Yeah, but go ahead, make your point.
That's my point.
Okay, we talked about.
If you read down through there with this thought in mind, you're going to see it's proud. It's
Yeah.
arrogant.
So, all right, so let's look at this. Revelation chapter 3. We made this point in the lesson that we did on congregational pride. We talked about Laodicea and their attitude. Do you remember what they were saying? That Jesus calls them out on this. He says, and we think Laodicea, we think, oh, this is the lukewarm church. And that's right. But why were they the lukewarm church? We're given the answer. It's right here in the text. Because, verse 17, this is the reason why. You say, I am rich, I've become wealthy, and I have need of nothing. That's what you're saying about yourself. And yet, Jesus says, you do not know that you're wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. And he goes on to say, I have everything you need to remedy this spirit within you. If you would take it from me, if you would buy it from me, I can heal you if you would be zealous and repent. So, as we're thinking about this spirit of a church that's stuck on self, you do get the impression from Laodicea that they have this spirit of maybe some complacency. Oh, we've got everything we need. We're doing great. We're doing fine. All is well here. We've got everything that we need. We're doing well. We have no need of anything else. And Jesus says, actually, you may be wealthy, but you're actually quite bankrupt. All right, good application. What else do you think you see in a church that has this attitude?
It's not uncommon to see a church change its focus when they're approaching a new building. They become focused on that building, it's a big source of pride.
Yeah, okay.
They put a lot of money into that building.
Yeah, that's a real good practical application. When a church has outgrown its current facility and they have to make a change, I mean, how many times have you seen it? We're making the decision to, build a new church building somewhere, or maybe just buy one that we can find else. And then they start going through that building process, and oftentimes what happens? The church splits. Why? Because of some kinds of disagreements that come up about, well, I don't like the brick color that they chose, or I don't like the carpet color or the paint, or, we spent a lot more money on this building than they said we were going to, and I'm not cool with this. And I mean, there's all kinds of squabbles that can come up over that thing. I've seen it before. I'm sure you have as well. But that might be an indication of a spiritual undercurrent of selfishness. All right, anything else? Sheree? Yes. Yeah, that's right. And that goes back, I think, to the Laodicea thing. And Cherie's comment was, if we don't truly express thankfulness and gratitude for God, to God for whatever seeming successes we may be going through, then that itself is an indication that we're selfish and we're not giving him the proper honor that he deserves. I think that's exactly right. So what then becomes the product? If you have a church that is stuck on itself and thinks that, it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, to use that old expression, what happens? Well, eventually you get a church that turns into more of a country club in the way that they interact with each other. So there's this spirit of elitism or separation, and maybe even indifference to those who are outside the club. We've got it all together in here, but if you're not in here, then you obviously don't have it together the way we have it together. And I think we see an example of this in the New Testament. Do you remember the Pharisees? The Pharisees were the separate ones. If I'm not mistaken, that's what their name means. The separated ones. Why are they separating themselves from everybody? You know the answer. What was their attitude toward everybody else? Everybody else is inferior to us. We're the only ones who take God seriously. And we're the only ones who've got it all figured out. You see examples of this in passages like Luke 18. You remember this text? The parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. And the Pharisee stood and prayed thus to himself, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, swindlers, unjust, extortioners, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I possess. But the tax collector, standing some distance away, would not even lift his eyes toward heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. I think it's really important that we see verse 9 before we consider that parable. He told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and they viewed others with contempt. Why does this Pharisee view this tax collector with contempt? Now, there are things we're told in the parable. What kinds of judgments does this Pharisee make that show that separate status that he gave to himself? What does he say about himself? Come on, what does he say? I'm glad I'm not like other people. I mean, that's the separatist, elitist attitude summarized in one expression, right? Now, there's a sense in which I'm glad I'm not like other people. And I think it's a legitimate sense. I'm glad that, I wasn't born in Afghanistan milking goats or something like that, I'm privileged in ways that many people in this world are, but that's not what he means. That's not what he's talking about. He's not saying, God, I'm so thankful that I was born into privileged status and I have good people who love me. And no, that's not what he's saying. When he says, or even as this tax collector, then we know exactly what he means. I'm thankful that I'm not a swindler and an adulterer too, right? But that's not what he means. I am better than this guy over here. And God, I thank you that you didn't make me like him. I fast twice a week. I pay my tithes. I do all these great things. God, aren't you glad I'm on your team? So the elitism here, the separateness here is pretty obvious in this example. So here is this one man, this Pharisee, who is a part of this broader religious group who all have the same attitude that he has. We're better than everybody else. Nobody else compares to us in terms of greatness and value to God. How about Matthew chapter 23? In Matthew 23, Jesus gives the woes that he pronounces on the Pharisees, and really he exposes them for the hypocrites that they are. And there's a number of things that he says about them here that are very, very condemning of these Pharisees and their actions and their attitudes. In verse 2, he says, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. In other words, they've made themselves the lawgivers, and they're the ones who tell you what you are to be doing and how you are to serve God according to the law. Therefore, verse 3, all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. They have a standard for themselves and then a standard for you. So do what they say as long as their instruction is coming from the law, but don't do as they do. Verse 5, they do all their deeds to be noticed by men. They love the place of honor, in verse 6, at the banquets and chief seats in the synagogues, and respectful greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by men. Whoever, verse 12, exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. This class of people in Jesus' day took on this self-absorbed mentality isolated themselves from everybody else, and then put down everybody else who was not good enough to be in their class. And the problem is, like the church in Laodicea, they thought that they were rich and wealthy and had everything that they needed, but Jesus had a very different view of them. And the same thing is true for the Pharisees. Matthew chapter 23 brings that out. What was Jesus' view of the Pharisees? Read that chapter, and you'll see he called them out for this attitude and for their hypocrisy. Ronnie?
Would the word elitism fit into this?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. Especially in light of the statement, that they place themselves in the seat of Moses. We're the lawgiver. We're the teachers of the law. You must listen to what we say because we're the knowledgeable ones, and you must obey what we say. And how many times did they take their own traditions and even dismiss the law of Moses because of the value that they placed on their own teachings and their own interpretations? I think that's exactly a fitting word. Yeah. All right. What else do you see here? Alan?
I'd like to make a point that would pertain to our particular area.
Yeah.
That is that there are areas of the country that are growing, there are areas of the country that aren't growing. And those areas of the country that are growing, like Greenville, are going to have an attraction to people moving in and that kind of thing. And so I think it's important that when the church benefits from that growth, that we don't take credit for that. That's not real kingdom growth.
Mm-hmm.
That's just somebody moving from one place to another place.
Yeah.
And then and so it would be easy for us if we had blinders on to look at our church, which is a growing church, and I'm thankful for that. But some of the growth that we've experienced is at the expense of another congregation somewhere.
Yes.
And so we have to make sure that we understand that we really don't get credit for that growth.
Right.
We need to be preaching the gospel. We need to be preaching the lost. We're thankful for other people that come in, but we shouldn't be taking credit for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember Brother Banning making that point when he was here with us. He did a lesson on why churches decline, and he made the point about churches that live and thrive when the economy is doing well will also dwindle and die when the economy is not. And that was a really good point that I thought stuck out specifically to us in this area, because this is, as you said, this is a growing area, and we've seen some of that. So we appreciate that, we value that, but we don't want to act as if that's all there is. That's a good point. All right, so we know then what we don't want to be. We don't want to have this attitude that keeps our focus on ourselves. So instead, I think we need to look at the church at Antioch. The church at Antioch is the opposite of a selfish, self-absorbed church. There are a number of great things that we could comment on about the church at Antioch. So I'm going to Acts chapter 11. I want you to go there with me if you would. Acts chapter 11. And I'm talking about the church in Antioch of Syria, just so we're clear, not Antioch in the region of Pisidia. Those are two different Antiochs. Antioch in Syria, this is the first predominantly Gentile church that we read about in the New Testament. It's not to say that there were not other Gentiles converted before them. Certainly there were. But this is the first local church that we read of that is predominantly comprised of Gentiles. In Acts chapter 11 and verse 19, so then those who were scattered because of the persecution that occurred in connection with Stephen made their way to Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, speaking the word to no one except to Jews alone. But there were some of them, men of Cyprus and Cyrene, who came to Antioch and began preaching to the Greeks, also preaching the Lord Jesus. And the hand of the Lord was with them, and a large number who believed turned to the Lord. The news about them reached the ears of the church at Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas off to Antioch. So this is the first, again, predominantly Gentile church that we read about. And when the church down in Jerusalem hears about this new church up in Antioch, they send Barnabas to go up there and work with them and help get that work going. And he gets there and he immediately recognizes that there's a lot of work to be done. So he actually leaves Antioch. He goes over to Tarsus to find a guy named Paul and bring him back to Antioch. And I believe the text says that they worked in Antioch for about a year, I think, verse 26, maybe somewhere around there. I think it says they worked with the church for a year. So these men, whoever they were, who helped start the church at Antioch, where was their focus? Did you notice it said in verse 19 that the ones who left Jerusalem because of the persecution, they went out preaching, but they only preached to Jews? Yeah. But, verse 20, some of them came to Antioch and began preaching to Gentiles. Where was their focus? It's interesting. We don't know who those men were. But they said, maybe we should start sharing the gospel with non-Jews. Why don't we try that? And so those men, whoever they were, had an outward focus. It wasn't just, let's just keep it among the Jews because that's really all we've done thus far, save Cornelius and some others. Let's spread the word to non-Jews. So then this church has its beginning. And as Paul and Barnabas work with this church, it continues to grow and do well. And then later in the chapter, in verse 27 beginning, we read about Agabus, the prophet, who came and made this prophecy, this pronouncement about a great famine that would take place. And in verse 29, in the proportion that any of the disciples had means, each of them, and we're talking about the church in Antioch here, determined to send the contribution for the relief of the brethren living in Judea. And this they did, sending it in charge of Barnabas and Saul to the elders. So what does the church at Antioch do here? They gather up funds as they were able, and they gave that money to Barnabas and Paul or Saul and sent it to elders of churches in Judea. Where is their focus? There's people that need help. We're going to help these people. We're going to help these Christians down in Judea who need help. In Acts chapter 13, Bill, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's an underlying thing in that text that you read. Talk about a focus. I guess we might call it a secondary focus, not necessarily a secondary importance. But you notice in that reading that you just read to us, there's about 4 or 5 times in there they turn to the Lord.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, something that would be pretty commendable for a church.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. That's right. I've got a...
Turn to the Lord, all these other things fell into place.
Yes. I got a whole sermon on that you just took away from me. All right. Acts chapter 13. Paul's first missionary journey begins right here. The Holy Spirit speaks in chapter 13 and in verse 2 and says, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul to the work that I've called them. The church in Antioch is where this is happening. And the church lays their hands on them, I think, as a pronouncement of blessing and God's will to be upon them. And they send them out. And you know this because I've said it to you 1,000 times. All of Paul's journeys started where? Antioch, right here. All 3 of his missionary journeys started here. And don't you think the church would have given him money if they were able to do that? They would have given him any kind of support that they could have given him. All 3 of those journeys begin there. I forgot that's on your handout. Yeah. All right. So, of course, you knew the answer to that. And by the way, I gave you there by that point number 4. That was 5 minutes. What happened? It was like a 30-second warning. I gave you the verse references there to the changes from one journey to the other. All right. I'll close with this. We all need broader vision. There is so much more going on in this world as it relates to the kingdom of God, the spreading of the gospel. There's so much more in this world going on outside of us. And so we need to make sure that we don't get absorbed with what's going on inside these 4 walls, broaden our vision, be praying about other efforts in other places, and hoping that God's kingdom prevails throughout the world. All right. Thank you, everybody.